Is a PowerPoint. The title, A Little Light Dispels a Lot of Darkness, Hanukkah as America's Jewish Holiday. The title comes from a saying in Hebrew, Ma'at or Doche Harbe Min HaChoshech, which is ascribed to the Besh, to the Baal Shem Tov. And I thank Kavod on the Road for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. What I've done is I've assembled a few things of interest to me, including some of the topics that I've covered at what is now known as Kavod Senior Life over the past couple of years. In many ways, Hanukkah is America's Jewish holiday. The Festival of Lights, with its Hanukkah Menorah, exchange of gifts, and inspirational account of ancient struggle for religious liberty, corresponds well with the American narrative and ideals. And in turn, American ideals often shape our observance of the holiday. We're today going to learn about its history, alternate ways of telling the story, about practices in America and elsewhere, such as candlelighting, Rock of Ages, and the Daughters Festival. We're going to explore December dilemma, and I always like to put this in much, much more, although I'll try to keep it to 40 minutes. I hope this will get us ready for Hanukkah 2020. I'm going to spend a moment just talking a little bit about the narratives. The narrative that I think we all share when we think about Hanukkah is a band of Maccabees courageously fighting for religious liberty, for the ability to be true to our own traditions and not to have a colonialist regime, if we use such a term, trample its basic rights. I don't know that that's the only narrative. The prayer book and the songs that we sing and many of the other ways in which we tell about Hanukkah have many, many different narratives, perhaps not as many as there are for Passover, but there is the narrative of rededication of the temple. The menorah that we light is purposefully different from the temple lights, but halacha, according to the Babylonian Talmud, we could only light one candle and put it outside. Instead, we have a device that reminds us of the ancient temple, so that Hanukkah represents a rededication of the temple by its very name. Another narrative is one that I think was more common in Israel, and certainly is one that one hears from time to time here, but it's rarely stressed. In Israel, I remember when my kids were young that they learned about the Mityavnim, the Hellenizers, and very often the presentation was that the Hasidim, the pietists, were fighting against the Mityavnim, the assimilationists or the Hellenizers, the ones who went to Greek schools and participated in Greek sports and tried to live the modern Hellenistic way of life. They were attacked and overcome by pietists who wanted to return to a more traditional way of life, observing traditional Jewish law and so on. I'm not going to get into all the details of what that might mean because I'm going to cover other things. But it is important to know that there are those stories as well. Maos Tzur, the song that we sing, if we look at it carefully, has an awful lot of values about divine intervention in order to save the Jewish people and a hope for the rededication of the temple with a surprisingly physical and visceral notion about what that might mean. Finally, I'm going to mention the two more things. I don't know that I have as much to say as I thought when I wrote the blurb about the so-called December dilemma, although we can talk about that. It is the idea that Christmas is such a big holiday in the American world. What do we do about Hanukkah? It will shape some of the discussions that we'll have in the next few minutes. But I do want to talk about a different way of narrating the festival. These days, for the past couple of decades, many people around the world have been particularly interested in restoring the female aspect, the women's aspect of Jewish life, Hanukkah is an exemplary holiday for talking about women's involvement in Judaism, one for which in America we have not done very much about that, but in the Sephardic world and to a lesser extent in modern Israel, there is quite a bit of discussion about women's role in Hanukkah. Well, first of all, Hanukkah is a reasonably well represented holiday in terms of American Jewish practice. The sources I presented here are from a website by Shmuel Rosner, which he posted in 2012. I tried to find something more recently. I ran out of time, basically. The most important thing to me was that the Pew Research sites that I looked at did not come back to the notion about how many people light Hanukkah lights. But in the United States, 72% were reported by the National Jewish Population Survey. This website talks about this as being, I think, 2009. 2009, 72% of US Jews reported lighting candles on all or most nights of Hanukkah. The NJPS did not distinguish, in my recollection, I did not recheck this, whether or not this were Jews by religion or Jews not by religion, something the Pew Research material does check. In Israel, the numbers are slightly higher, and it's interesting to me that they went up between 1999 and 2009. If you contrast this with Sabbath candles, with Shabbat candles, only 28% of American Jews reported lighting Shabbat candles. So that Hanukkah, for which there are only 8 days that one can light candles, all or most means even one day, is far more widely observed in the idea of lighting the candles than Shabbat, than the Sabbath. An interesting statistic. Rosner goes on to point out that the big differences have to do with kosher food and a number of other highbrow activities. Interestingly, the Pew Trust looks at some observance, no matter how minimal, of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and of attending some sort of a Passover Seder. Not the question of what is in the Seder or how, whether or not it's, 3 brachot or maybe 4 and then let's eat, or whether it's a long drawn out affair. But those are the things which are posted by the Pew Trust. I've seen other responses which suggest that Hanukkah is far more widely observed than the Pew Research survey in 2013 would have suggested. It largely ignored it, again, with a quick review that I have today. The Mal Sur is a good example of the Americanization of the holiday. Here I'm going to give you a translation of the first and the last verse of the traditional Hebrew in translation. And what I'd like to do is I would like to have us all sing a classic American version of this song that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But here's a translation. Ma'osu Yeshuati, O fortress, rock of my salvation, to you it is fitting to give praise. Restore my house of prayer, that is the reference to Tikon Beit Tefilati, the house of my prayer. Reference presumably to the temple, although a house of prayer is actually a reference to the passage in Isaiah that might be familiar to many people. My house shall become a house of prayer for all people, and there I shall offer you thanksgiving, a reference to the restoration of the sacrifices. B'sham Todah Nizabech, that offering is a sacrificial offering, a zevach, a sacrifice. That's a reference to the Thanksgiving offering. When you have readied for the slaughter of the barking foe, Mitzar HaMenabeach, Menabeach means to bark. Then I will complete with song and Psalm, the dedication of your altar. Very, very strong words. The final stanza, bear your holy arm and hasten the end for salvation. Avenge the vengeance of your servant's blood from the wicked nation, for the triumph is too long delayed for us. There is no end to the days of evil. Repel the red one in the nethermost shadow and establish for us the seven shepherds. I'm not going to go into all the references, although they're quite interesting. I just mentioned, though, I saw a reference that suggests the poet had in mind Yeshua, the end of salvation, also a reference to Christianity, Yeshua being a Hebrew form of the name of the founder of Christianity, Jesus. Finally, repel the red one. Sometimes this is given to suggest that the author, traditionally called Mordechai, based on the first letters of the stanzas, the author of the poem lived sometime in the 12th or 13th or 14th centuries. And it might very well be that Frederick Barbarossa in the 13th century was the person who was hoped to be repelled by the text. But it looks forward to the salvation and to setting up the third temple, if you will. Here is a version that I'm sure most of you know, ascribed to Marcus Jastrow and Gustav Gluckheil in a prayer book that's published. They both died in 1903. I don't know when they did the translation or whether, in fact, they wrote it. In theory, it is a translation of a German version. I have a link to the German version, which I will show you in a moment. But we might as well sing it. It's all familiar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how this represents a very late 19th, early 20th century version of what Hanukkah should be in America. So you can unmute yourselves if you want, but singing on Zoom doesn't always work very well. So we'll meet you at the end. Rock of ages, let our song praise thy saving power. Thou amidst the raging foes wast our sheltering tower. Furious they assailed us, but thou availed us. And thy word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. I should repeat the last verse, but I'm not going to. Let's look at the ideas in verses 2 and 3. Kindling new the holy lamps, priest approved in suffering. Suffering rather than the rather strong terms of the Hebrew original. Purified the nation's shrine, brought to God their offering. The language is now past tense. And his court surrounding, here in joy abounding, happy throng singing songs with a mighty sounding. The rhyming is very nice, and that may be a reference to the contemporary observation. Children of the Martyr Race was written, as I said, back in the early 20th century, late 19th century, way before the Holocaust. Whether free or fettered, wake the echoes of the songs, where ye may be scattered. The idea is that the songs are songs which are addressed towards free people, we think the American environment, or fettered people. Maybe the Jews thinking about Jews all around the world, or maybe Jews thinking about expanding the Jewish idea of the Maccabees to take all fettered people all over the world. Yours the message cheering that the time is nearing, which will see all men free, tyrants disappearing. The vision of Mao's Tzu in English that many of us grew up with ends, which will see all men free, tyrants disappearing. Universal freedom and the end of tyranny. What better American message could there be than that? In terms of the American Hanukkah, Diane Ashton published a book about 7 years ago called Hanukkah in America. And I'm going to try to redo the screen sharing. I may or may not lose you with this. But she has, first I'm going to read the blurb, and then I'm going to go back to the screen share. The book blurb had a number of practices in America that illustrate what she has in mind. Here she has from New Orleans, Hanukkah means decorating your door with a menorah made of hominy grits. Cilantro and cayenne pepper for latkes in Texas. That sounds great. Cayenne pepper, I think most of us would prefer applesauce and sour cream. Cincinnati, eating oranges and ice cream. I'd have to read the book to know what that is. American Jews have transformed the ancient holiday from a simple occasion to something grand. And she argues that it's providing an alternative to the Christian denominated December. Rabbis and lay people address the contemporary hopes by fashioning an authentically Jewish festival in their American world. Now I'm going to go back and show you a website. Nice thing about the web is that I can cheat. It's a lot simpler, and she has everything that I could possibly use. Here is how Diane Ashton talks about it. I believe it's her simply because there's a reference to her book, which I was very happy to see. I couldn't find whether or not it was signed up at the top. She posted this 2 years ago. So here's the backstory. They had tossing out statues of Hellenic gods, Antiochus, Antiochus. Each Hanukkah evening, Jews light a candle. 7 million Jews, but she says until the 19th century, America's population was very, very small. And she argues there weren't many Torah scrolls, there weren't many Jewish calendars, and her research suggests that America's Jews were interested in things like Rosh Hashanah and Jewish cemeteries. Some of them were interested in kosher food. Some of them were interested in providing a very American style prayer book. And there wasn't that much about Hanukkah. Her starting point was for Hanukkah observance in the United States was a hymn written by a lady from Charleston, South Carolina, Penina Moise. I imagine is how it's pronounced, maybe Moise, clearly from Moshe. And in 1840, there may have been Sfaradim, still as the majority in Charleston, South Carolina. And there you go. In any case, it was written not because of the importance of Hanukkah, but because of the importance of Christmas. There are lots of Christmas carols, and Penina Moise thought that it would be necessary to inspire Jewish dedication, and it was included in Beth Elohim, one of the most important synagogues in the South or in the United States in the early period of time. Great arbiter of human fate, whose glory ne'er decays, to thee alone we dedicate the song and soul of praise. Ashton's note talks about the increase in Jewish life shortly after the Civil War. Historically, this is very important. The Civil War really was a demarcation because American Jews served in the Union Army and in the Confederate Army as well, and fought for rights to have a Seder and sometimes even to have Sabbath observance and kosher food. American Judaism really was transformed in the generation that followed the Civil War, and by that generation. You also had from the 1860s and even from the 1840s on, tremendous immigration in American Jewish terms from Central Europe that transformed the Jewish community from the largely Sephardic communities that had been before. In any case, here's an example of Cincinnati rabbi Max Lilienthal, very important, who adapted special Christmas events for children to make them more about Hanukkah. And Isaac Mayer Wise, Lilienthal and Wise were very important in the formation of what is now known as Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. Its main campus, or its only campus in those days, were in Cincinnati. And they talked about being modern Maccabees. She gives some more conversations about how immigrants in the United States between 1880 and 1920 adopted the Christmas notion of exchanging gifts, but transferred that to Hanukkah. Now, as far as I can tell, the gifts that were given on Hanukkah in the old country were Hanukkah gel. They got coins, they got clothes. They didn't get lots of finely wrapped packages around the Hanukkah menorah. In any case, it's an interesting article, and you can find this very, very quickly. I mentioned before that one of the curious things about Hanukkah is that an alternate way of discussing it could very well have been about women's roles in Hanukkah. This comes from a study sheet that I prepared for the Kavod Shabbat morning group a couple years back. Chag HaBanot, and it's actually an Arabic original, Eid al-Banat, was celebrated in Arabic countries. The traditional knowledge, as far as I can tell, was that it was celebrated on the island of Jerba in what is today Tunisia, going back for generations, and was instituted by the Alliance Israélite Universelle in 1925 as a kind of bat mitzvah for girls. Interestingly, having a bat mitzvah for women on Rosh Chodesh links together the idea of Rosh Chodesh as a women's festival, and the date 1925 makes this far earlier than what is celebrated by American women as the first bat mitzvah of the daughter of Mordechai Kaplan, Judith Kaplan Eisenstein, many years after that. It's interesting to note that in Tunisia, they beat that, if you will, by a generation. The reason for associating Rosh Chodesh is beyond the scope of what I want to talk about, but the reason for Rosh Chodesh on Hanukkah really is. There are lots and lots of those examples. You can read it, but I'm going to walk you through my study sheet. And research that I did a while back suggested that the practice spread throughout the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools throughout North Africa and Salonika and many other places, and having an annual celebration that was celebrating women. So one of the sources in the book of Ezra, and this is that in the 9th month, the 20th of the month, just before what would become Hanukkah, and Ezra the priest got up and said, "You have trespassed by bringing home foreign women, aggravating the guilt of Israel. Now make confession to the Lord, the God of your fathers." And then the people said, "We'll do just as you say." Now, one of the reasons why this was important is because if the men sent away their foreign wives, of course, they now had to marry local women, and this was good for the women. Today, we might chuckle that this is not exactly a feminist way of celebrating women's roles, but in pre-modern times, it very much was. Esther is associated with Hanukkah as well. As we read in the Megillah, when the turn for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, came, she did not ask for anything but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, guardian of the women, advised. Yet Esther won the admiration of all who saw her, and she was taken to King Ahasuerus in the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet. And tradition assumes that this was on the first day of Tevet, which falls during Hanukkah. And so the king gave a great banquet, and they gave a remission of taxes, and the distributed gifts as befits a king. So we have an association of Esther becoming queen and having a celebration on Hanukkah, and specifically on Rosh Chodesh Tevet. A more surprising one is the daughter of Jephthah. In Judges chapter 11, we hear Miyamim Yamima Telachna Benot Yisrael Tanot Levat Yiftach Giladi Arba'at Yamim Bashana. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Jephthah's daughter. Jephthah was an outcast who had some sort of military genius. He was asked by the members of the tribes of Israel to fight the Ammonites. He made a vow that he would offer the first thing that came out of his house to greet him, thinking that it would be livestock. In fact, it was his daughter, and the story concludes by saying every year the daughters of Israel would go to Litanot, probably means something like to mourn or to remember or to have a commemoration of the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, for 4 years during 4 days during the year. I have no idea what this is. I have no idea whether the daughter of Jephthah ever was sacrificed in the temple or anyplace else. But I do know that in the Middle Ages, a guy named Abu Darham or Abu Draham, in something called Shar HaMoadot, I think, or Shar HaZmanim, in his book on synagogue practice, says the following. Matzati katuv sheyesh lizaher b'chol tekufa me'arba'atan. I found it written that one has to be careful on every solstice and equinox day, not to drink water, b'sha'ata tekufa, in the time of the equinox or solstice, mishum sakana, because of danger. Sholo yinazek v'yitnapech tekufat tevet hi lefi shebaoto perek nishchata bat yiftach. V'nevchu kol hamemot l'dam. Of the 4 solstices and equinoxes, he understands that Tikufat Tevet, this is the December solstice. Tikufat Tevet, Hilafi Shaboto Perik, in that period of time, that is when Bat Yiftach was slaughtered, and all of the waters turned to blood presumably throughout the entire country. So we have a reference to Bat Yiftach also being something in the wintertime, not specifically the festival of Hanukkah, but during that very time that Hanukkah happens. The next reference is a much more interesting one. This is texts from the books of Maccabees. The books of Maccabees were written by Jews, especially the first and the second one. There are 4. They did not become part of the Bible as it's understood by Jews. I'm not going to read all of the text, but there are a couple of references here that are of interest. One story talks about a woman with 7 a woman with 7 children were apprehended, and the king asked them to eat pork, and they were tormented. And then there's a famous story about this and how they went through it, and there are various versions of the story. This woman is sometimes called Hannah and sometimes called Miriam the Hasmonean, which is interesting because Miriam the Hasmonean was also the name of the last of the Hasmonean house, the wife of Herod the Great. But sometimes this woman is called Miriam the Hasmonean, said in the year 167 BCE, as a woman who lost all 7 of her children, based on various stories. The story that I just showed you has to do with eating pork, but there are other versions of them. And I'm just going to go quickly through this. This last part has to do, the cruel tyrant talked about causing him to look like he would bow down before the image. And he said, I won't obey the commandment of the king, but the commandment of the Torah, which was given to Moses, and so on and so forth. Now, there are various versions of this, and the stories generally say that after the woman lost her 7 sons, she also was consumed. There are a number of versions of the story. It was very popular in Jewish texts, even if the book of Maccabees did not survive. One version has to do with that the Greeks were going to send all the women of Palestine to prostitution, and the boys who were going to be enslaved decided that they also would jump into the sea in order to survive. And then another version of the story of worshiping the idol, and this is in Gittin, this is in the Talmud. And then another one, Bagris the wicked and all his armies came to Jerusalem, and the woman and his wife were brought before them, and they were hung, they were executed and hung opposite their children. Then a woman bore a son after the death of the husband, and she circumcised him, and she jumped off the wall. So there are many, many stories about the resistance of women and children to the Greeks, which were memorialized in Jewish sources, which did survive. This one is from Megillat HaHashmonaim. When I was a kid, this was in prayer books. It was in the Birnbaum full prayer book, and I think maybe even the Sabbath prayer book. You don't see it all that often these days. And finally, we have a reference to Hanukkah as being 8 days, and this one does not have a reference to women. It does have a question of what the menorah looked like. They fixed it. They came out from a narrow place into broad spaces. They said praises and thanksgiving, lighting lamps in purity. Since the Greeks had gone into the temple and defiled all the vessels, there was nothing with which to light. The Hasmoneans were victorious. They brought 7 skewers of iron, covered them with tin, and began to light. What's interesting about this is the discussion of the earliest lighting. It was 8 days for all sorts of reasons, and my guess is historically the most important reason had to do with the festival of Sukkot, which had not been able to be observed that year. But they didn't really have the menorah. They bought iron poles and covered them with tin, and they lit them in the temple, and people lit lights all over the place. Going back to the question of women, we learn from the Talmud in a number of places that Hanukkah and Purim and Passover share a unique quality. Women are obligated in lighting the Hanukkah light, women are obligated in reading the Megillah, and women are obligated in the 4 cups of Passover because they were included in the miracle of being saved from persecution, whether it is being killed by Haman or being persecuted by the Greeks or being slaves in Egypt. Rashi has one more story that I want to talk about in terms of women in general. Rashi preserves in his Rashi is a medieval commentator who talks, comments on the Hebrew Bible and on the Talmud. And he has an idea that one of the things that the Greeks wanted to do was have all women, when they're about to be married, brought to the government first, and that the sometimes called euspine noctis, the women would have their first sexual activity done by the governor or by the king, and not by their husbands.
Okay.
And that, well, hold on one moment, please. Yeah, okay. Well, the final thing on this worksheet is a lengthy passage from the book of Judith, which is part of the Catholic Bible, like the books of Maccabees, but not part of the Jewish Bible. The story was well known. Judith was a woman who was fancied by the Greek governor, Greek general's name was Holofernes, and she devised a system by which Holofernes' head was chopped off by her, and she went back to the Jewish camp. And some people say that it's Judith who ended the practice of the first night, and that this happened as part of the Hanukkah story. I don't know for sure. Looking at the text, it's not clear that that's what it was, but I'm going to leave that to you if you're interested in that. I have one more brief comment that I wanted to make from stuff that I've talked about at the Kavod. Kavod had a large Russian population for many years, and I found this piece of research very interesting. Why do we have latkes? Well, we know they have sufganiyot, they have donuts in Israel, and in America, though, we have the Hanukkah is associated with the latkes. And I suggested, based on my research, that this was the same as oladja, a small pancake. And the modern Hebrew term is leviva, yet another connection with women. This is part of a lecture that I gave to the folks in my synagogue services at Kavod. Leviva is a term that is found in the Bible in the story of Amnon and Tamar. And Amnon asks his half-sister Tamar to fry him some sort of a fried dough thingy. And I don't know that the fried salty cheese dishes that we had with Judith that fed the general Holofernes are also latkes, and that's the connection. What was interesting to me is that although the oladja, the small pancake, is a word for the pancake, and we think about that as being a cake made in a pan, the story of oladja apparently is more related to the olive oil as well. So the donuts are fried with oil. In terms of the dreidel, gambling and games with tops were very widespread, and the dreidel clearly comes from the words from Yiddish, and we talked about this. This is probably nothing to do originally with Hanukkah. The idea of gambling and playing games with tops during the long winter nights probably preceded the association with Hanukkah. And the Yiddish words on the dreidel mean nothing, get half a pot, get half the pot and put into the pot. But Nes Gadol Hayasham. And I will stop my formal presentation by saying that my guess is that the Israeli dreidel, Nes Gadol Hayapo, the letters were invented by Levin Kipnis, one of my personal heroes, for his tremendous work for creating an entire body of children's literature and children's song.